Earl Joseph Whitmore stood at the edge of his newly acquired 12-acre plot on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, watching the morning frost cling to the tall grass that would soon disappear under the foundation of his final home. At 73, his weathered hands still held the steadiness that had guided cattle through blizzards and mended fence posts for 5 decades. But the ranching life that had defined him was ending. The corporate buyout of the rocking K Ranch had left him with enough money to purchase this land and build something modest, something that would see him through whatever years remained. The real estate agent had warned him about the winters here, speaking as if Earl had never experienced Montana cold. The woman, barely 30, and wearing a city coat that would prove useless in a real storm, explained how the previous owner had struggled with heating costs and suggested he consider a manufactured home with modern insulation and efficient heating systems. Earl had nodded politely, his pale blue eyes scanning the terrain with a practiced understanding that she could never possess. When Earl announced his plans to build the cabin himself, using techniques he had learned from his grandfather, the response from the small community was immediate and predictable. At Henderson's Hardware, where he purchased his initial supplies, the younger men behind the counter exchanged glances when he requested materials that seemed outdated to their modern sensibilities. Doug Henderson, the owner's son, had taken over much of the daily operations and prided himself on keeping up with construction trends and energy efficiency standards. Doug recommended modern insulation materials, vapor barriers, and forced air heating systems that would keep the cabin comfortable throughout Montana's harsh winters. He explained the importance of building codes and energy ratings, speaking with the confidence of someone who had attended community college courses on contemporary construction methods. Earl listened without interruption, his calloused fingers turning over each product brochure, before quietly requesting the materials he had originally specified. The foundation Earl laid differed significantly from contemporary practices. Instead of the standard concrete slab or crawl space that local builders preferred, he dug deeper, creating a stone foundation that extended below the frost line in a pattern that seemed random to observers, but followed principles his grandfather had learned from Scandinavian immigrants in the 1880s. He gathered fieldstone from the surrounding area, selecting each piece for its density and thermal properties, fitting them together without mortar in certain sections where traditional technique demanded it. Local contractors driving past the property began to stop and observe Earl's methods with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Tom Bradley, who owned the most successful construction company in the area, made it a point to visit one afternoon under the pretense of offering assistance. Tom had built dozens of energy-efficient homes in the valley and considered himself an expert on Montana construction requirements. Tom watched Earl working alone, moving stones into position with a deliberateness that seemed inefficient by modern standards. He pointed out that Earl's foundation was unnecessarily deep and complicated, requiring far more labor than contemporary methods. The conversation that followed was brief and polite, with Tom explaining how modern concrete and steel construction could achieve superior results in a fraction of the time. Earl thanked him for the advice and continued his work unchanged. As autumn progressed and Earl's cabin began to take shape, the unusual aspects of his construction became more apparent to anyone who took the time to observe. The walls rose not with conventional 2x6 framing and standard insulation, but with a double wall system that incorporated materials and techniques most people had never encountered. Between the inner and outer walls, Earl packed a mixture of sawdust, clay, and materials he gathered himself from the surrounding landscape. The local building inspector, Marcus Webb, had been called out several times by neighbors who expressed concern about the unconventional construction. Marcus had been inspecting buildings in Gallatin County for 15 years and prided himself on ensuring all structures met contemporary safety and efficiency standards. Each visit to Earl's property resulted in lengthy conversations about building codes, insulation values, and heating requirements. Marcus explained that while Earl's methods might have been adequate for previous generations, modern standards existed for important reasons. He referenced energy efficiency ratings, fire safety codes, and structural requirements that Earl's design seemed to ignore. Marcus offered to connect Earl with local contractors who could bring the project up to current standards, ensuring it would pass final inspection and provide adequate comfort during Montana winters. Earl responded to each suggestion with courtesy, producing documentation that his methods complied with basic safety requirements while acknowledging they differed from contemporary approaches. He continued his work methodically, installing a heating system that combined a traditional wood-burning stove with thermal mass techniques that most people in the area had never seen implemented. The heating system Earl installed became a particular source of discussion among local residents. Instead of the forced air furnaces or radiant floor systems that were standard in new construction, Earl built what appeared to be an oversized fireplace surrounded by carefully placed stones and clay. The design incorporated channels that directed heat through the thermal mass of the walls, in patterns that seemed complex and unnecessary to modern observers. Jerry Caldwell, who had recently installed a state-of-the-art geothermal system in his new home, made several attempts to educate Earl about contemporary heating technology. Jerry explained how his system could maintain consistent temperatures throughout the winter, while using a fraction of the energy required by traditional wood heating. He offered to arrange a visit from the geothermal installation company, suggesting they could design a system that would keep Earl comfortable without the constant work of maintaining wood fires. Earl listened to Jerry's enthusiasm for modern technology with the patience of someone who had spent decades observing the gap between theory and practice. He thanked Jerry for the information and continued installing his thermal mass system, placing each stone according to principles that had been tested by harsh realities rather than laboratory conditions. As winter approached, the conversations about Earl's cabin became more frequent at Murphy's Diner, where local residents gathered each morning for coffee and discussion of community affairs. The consensus among the regulars was that Earl, despite his experience with Montana weather, had made a serious miscalculation in his construction methods. Several people expressed genuine concern about whether the elderly man would be able to stay warm once the serious cold arrived. Bill Murphy, who had owned the diner for 23 years and had seen many newcomers struggle with Montana winters, felt particularly worried about Earl's situation. Bill had watched several people attempt to heat inadequately constructed homes, resulting in massive utility bills and uncomfortable living conditions. He approached Earl one morning as the old man sat alone at a corner table, drinking coffee and reading a week-old newspaper. Bill's attempt to discuss the upcoming winter was met with Earl's characteristic courtesy and quiet confidence. Earl explained that he had lived through many Montana winters and understood what the season would demand. He appreciated Bill's concern, but seemed untroubled by the warnings that had become increasingly frequent as November approached. The first serious cold snap arrived in early December, bringing temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for a week. Throughout the valley, heating systems strained to maintain comfortable indoor temperatures, while utility bills soared. Modern homes with efficient heating systems still required constant operation to combat the penetrating cold, and several households discovered inadequacies in their insulation or heating capacity. During this cold period, Earl's cabin became a subject of particular interest among his neighbors. Smoke rose steadily from his chimney, but not with the heavy, constant output that would indicate an overtaxed heating system. Several people drove past his property specifically to observe whether there were signs of trouble, but Earl's routine appeared unchanged. He continued to move around his property with the same steady pace, checking on outbuildings and maintaining his daily activities. Tom Bradley, whose construction company was receiving emergency calls from homeowners experiencing heating problems, found himself curious enough to visit Earl's property again. Tom's own home, built according to the highest contemporary standards, was requiring his furnace to run almost continuously to maintain 68 degrees. He was surprised to find Earl working in his yard without the heavy layers of clothing that the temperature seemed to demand. Tom's inquiry about how the cabin was performing during the cold spell was answered with Earl's typical understatement. Earl mentioned that the cabin was holding its temperature well and that the heating system was working as expected. Tom noted that the amount of wood stacked beside Earl's door seemed modest compared to what he would have expected for heating such a structure during sub-zero weather. The conversation that followed revealed information that surprised Tom and eventually spread throughout the local community. Earl explained that his heating system was based on principles his grandfather had learned from Norwegian settlers who had faced similar conditions with limited resources. The thermal mass system stored heat from periodic fires and released it gradually, maintaining comfortable temperatures with significantly less fuel than conventional systems required. Tom asked specific questions about the cabin's interior temperature and was surprised to learn that Earl was maintaining 72 degrees throughout the structure. Tom's own modern home was struggling to reach 68 degrees despite continuous heating, and his utility bills for December were already approaching 3 times their normal level. Earl's heating costs, by comparison, consisted only of the wood he cut himself from dead trees on his property. The second major test of Earl's construction came with the January blizzard that meteorologists had been tracking for several days before its arrival. The storm system promised to bring not only heavy snow, but also wind chills that would reach dangerous levels. Local authorities issued warnings about the potential for power outages and advised residents to prepare for possible heating emergencies. As the blizzard approached, Earl's preparations appeared minimal compared to the extensive measures his neighbors were taking, while others were stockpiling firewood, checking generators, and ensuring their heating systems were operating at peak efficiency. Earl simply brought in a modest supply of split wood and checked the seals around his doors and windows. His confidence seemed either admirable or dangerously naive, depending on the observer's perspective. The storm arrived with intensity that exceeded most predictions, bringing winds that reached 60 miles per hour and snow that accumulated at nearly 3 inches per hour. Power lines throughout the valley began failing as ice accumulated, and wind stressed the electrical infrastructure. By the second day of the storm, significant portions of Gallatin County were without electricity, leaving many residents dependent entirely on backup heating methods. Emergency services began receiving calls from people whose heating systems had failed or whose backup generators had proven inadequate. Several families had to be relocated to emergency shelters when their homes became uninhabitable due to heating failures. The storm was testing every structure in the valley, revealing weaknesses that normal winter weather had not exposed. During the worst of the blizzard, Earl's cabin stood remarkably stable against the wind, and the thermal mass system continued to maintain comfortable temperatures despite the power outage that affected the entire area. The deep foundation and carefully fitted stones of his construction absorbed and deflected the wind forces that were causing problems for conventionally built structures. His heating system, independent of electricity, continued to function exactly as designed. On the third day of the storm, when emergency crews began checking on isolated residents, Earl's property was among the first they visited due to concerns about his age and the unconventional nature of his heating system. The emergency responders expected to find either a very cold house or evidence that Earl had been burning furniture or other inappropriate materials to stay warm. Instead, they discovered a comfortably warm cabin where Earl was calmly reading by the light of a kerosene lamp. The interior temperature was a steady 71 degrees, maintained by a heating system that required only periodic attention to add wood to the thermal mass chamber. Earl offered the emergency workers coffee and seemed genuinely surprised that they had been concerned about his welfare. The emergency responders, who had spent the previous 2 days dealing with heating failures and dangerous conditions in modern homes, found Earl's situation remarkable enough to report to their supervisors. Word of the cabin's performance during the blizzard spread quickly through the emergency services community and eventually reached the general population through informal networks that operate efficiently in small communities. Marcus Webb, the building inspector who had expressed reservations about Earl's construction methods, made a point of visiting the property after the storm to assess how the structure had weathered the extreme conditions. Marcus had spent considerable time during the blizzard addressing emergency situations where modern buildings had experienced failures related to heating, structural stress, or ice damage. Marcus's inspection revealed that Earl's cabin had not only survived the storm without damage, but had actually performed better than many newer structures in the area. The deep stone foundation had prevented any frost heaving. The thermal mass walls had maintained stable temperatures throughout the power outage, and the overall design had proven remarkably resilient to the extreme weather conditions. The conversation between Marcus and Earl that day was notably different from their previous interactions. Marcus found himself asking questions about the specific techniques Earl had used, expressing genuine curiosity about methods that had proven so effective under severe testing. Earl explained some of the principles behind his grandfather's approach, emphasizing how each element of the design had been developed to address the specific challenges of heating in harsh climates with limited resources. Marcus learned that Earl's construction incorporated lessons from multiple cold climate cultures, combining Norwegian thermal mass techniques with Native American earth-sheltering principles and practical modifications developed through generations of trial and error. The result was a heating system that required minimal fuel, no electricity, and very little maintenance, while providing superior comfort and reliability. As winter continued and other heating systems in the valley struggled with ongoing cold spells, Earl's cabin became a subject of serious study among local contractors and building professionals. Tom Bradley, whose business was experiencing unprecedented demand for heating system repairs and emergency services, began asking Earl detailed questions about construction techniques that he had previously dismissed as outdated. Tom discovered that Earl's methods, while labor-intensive during construction, resulted in operating costs that were a fraction of what modern systems required. Earl's heating expenses for the entire winter would equal what Tom was spending on heating his own home during a single month of severe cold. The long-term economics of Earl's approach were becoming impossible to ignore. Doug Henderson at the hardware store began receiving requests for materials that Earl had specified months earlier, as other residents became interested in implementing similar thermal mass heating systems in their own properties. Doug found himself in the unusual position of having to research historical construction techniques in order to supply materials for methods that were proving superior to contemporary approaches. Bill Murphy at the diner noticed that conversations about Earl's cabin had shifted from amusement and concern to genuine respect and curiosity. Regular customers who had initially viewed Earl's construction methods as eccentric were now asking detailed questions about how such techniques might be adapted for their own heating needs. Earl's morning coffee routine at the diner became an informal consulting session for neighbors seeking practical advice. The transformation in community opinion became complete when February brought another severe cold snap that tested heating systems throughout the valley for nearly 2 weeks. Earl's cabin maintained its consistent comfort, while utility bills throughout the area reached levels that strained many household budgets. Several families whose heating systems had proven inadequate began making arrangements to spend time at the homes of relatives or friends until the weather moderated. During this prolonged cold period, Earl began receiving visits from people who wanted to see his heating system firsthand and understand how it achieved such remarkable efficiency. These visits revealed information about the origin of Earl's construction knowledge that surprised most people and explained the depth of his confidence in methods that had seemed so unconventional. Earl shared the story of an incident that had occurred 47 years earlier, when he had been working as a ranch hand in the northern part of the state during an early October blizzard that had caught everyone unprepared. A neighboring family's cabin had lost its chimney to high winds, leaving them without heat during sub-zero temperatures. Earl had spent 2 days constructing an emergency shelter using stones and earth-banking techniques his grandfather had taught him, creating a thermal mass system that kept a young girl alive until rescue arrived. That experience had taught Earl the practical effectiveness of traditional heating methods under extreme conditions, when modern conveniences were unavailable and survival depended entirely on understanding how to work with natural materials and principles. The techniques he had used to build his current cabin were refined versions of methods that had already proven themselves in life-or-death circumstances. The community's understanding of Earl's cabin evolved from viewing it as an elderly man's stubborn adherence to outdated methods to recognizing it as the application of thoroughly tested survival techniques that offered advantages over contemporary approaches. Earl's quiet confidence throughout the construction process was revealed to be based on direct experience with the effectiveness of traditional methods under severe conditions. As spring approached and the heating season neared its end, several local contractors began incorporating elements of Earl's thermal mass techniques into their own projects. Tom Bradley commissioned Earl to consult on a high-efficiency home design that combined traditional thermal mass principles with modern materials and construction methods. The resulting hybrid approach promised to achieve the reliability and efficiency of Earl's system while meeting contemporary building codes and aesthetic preferences. Marcus Webb updated his inspection procedures to include evaluation criteria for alternative heating systems that demonstrated practical effectiveness, even if they differed from standard approaches. His experience with Earl's cabin had shown him that adherence to contemporary standards did not guarantee superior performance under extreme conditions, while carefully applied traditional methods could exceed modern systems in important ways. Doug Henderson expanded his inventory to include materials commonly used in thermal mass construction, responding to increasing demand from contractors and homeowners who wanted to incorporate these proven techniques into their own projects. The hardware store began offering informational seminars where Earl shared practical knowledge about traditional construction methods adapted for contemporary applications. Earl's cabin had become an inadvertent demonstration project that challenged assumptions about heating efficiency, construction methods, and the relationship between traditional knowledge and modern technology. The building's superior performance during the severe winter had established the practical value of techniques that many people had dismissed without understanding their underlying principles or historical development. The validation Earl experienced was quiet and practical, rather than dramatic or emotional. He had not built his cabin to prove a point or demonstrate superior knowledge, but simply to create a comfortable home, using methods he trusted from direct experience. The recognition his techniques received was satisfying in a modest way, confirming what he had known from the beginning about their effectiveness. Earl continued his morning routine at Murphy's Diner, where conversations now included respectful questions about construction techniques and practical advice about heating systems. His status in the community had evolved from that of an eccentric elderly man using outdated methods to a valuable source of knowledge about proven approaches to one of Montana's most persistent challenges. The lesson embedded in Earl's cabin extended beyond construction techniques to encompass broader questions about the relationship between innovation and tradition, the value of accumulated knowledge, and the importance of testing ideas against real-world conditions rather than accepting them based on theoretical advantages or contemporary popularity.